Pearson. I have some questions I wanted to ask you about your professional title. And because you're often accused of not being a climate change scientist, but isn't that a fairly new degree in the university world?
Absolutely. No, I do not have a degree in climate science. And guess what? James Hansen doesn't either. And guess what? Michael Mann doesn't either. Those are the two best known climate scientists in the country and probably in the world. From their own CVs, which you can find online, James Hansen's degrees, all of which come from the University of Iowa, are a Bachelor of Arts, Physics and Mathematics, Master of Science in Astronomy, and a PhD in Physics. None of those, you'll notice, is climate science. Michael Mann's degrees from University of California, Berkeley, and AB in Applied Math and Physics. From Yale, where he got his master's and PhD, master's in physics and PhD in geology and geophysics. None of those say climate science. In fact, when I left active service at the University of Arizona in 2008, the University of Arizona, which is one of the leading universities in terms of climate change research, they had recently agreed to a PhD minor in climate science. That's it. So there's no degree, there's no major you can get at any level at that time. I don't know if they've changed that. I doubt if they have. But at the time, they had a PhD minor in climate science. So my degrees, I have a bachelor's degree in forestry, forest science specifically, that's a Bachelor of Science degree at the University of Idaho. And then my Master of Science and my PhD are both in range science at Texas Tech University. If you want, I can ramble on about Texas Tech University and what it means to have a range science degree. Right, I don't talk about my climate science degree because I don't have one. And I've never said that I have a degree in climate science. And I'm frequently accused of not having a degree in climate science. I never said I did. So I don't know where that accusation comes from. Oh, and by the way, James Hansen doesn't have a degree in climate science either. Oh, and by the way, Michael Mann doesn't either. And almost nobody in the world has a degree, maybe a minor, but not a degree in climate science. So don't yell at me for not having a degree in climate science. It doesn't make any sense at all. My master's and PhD degrees from Texas Tech University are both in range science. And I don't mention that very often, even though they're science-oriented degrees from a serious, significant university. One of people's favorite climate scientists to turn to is Katharine Hayhoe, who is at Texas Tech University. Anyway, I don't talk about my range science degrees very often because most people don't know what that is. They think that it comes about from spending a lot of time in the kitchen, working on the range. No, that's not it. Or they think I must know a lot about livestock. And in fact, I didn't study much about livestock when I was working on my master's or PhD. The reason I went to Texas Tech University was because the world's leading authority on fire ecology at that time was a professor there and department head in the Department of Range Science and Wildlife Science, Range, Wildlife, and Fishery Science. And his name was Henry A. Wright, and he had relatively recently written what was for many years the leading text on fire ecology. He wrote it with a guy named Art Bailey from Canada. And it was called Fire Ecology of the United States and Southern Canada, I think. In any event, Henry Wright was the world's leading authority on fire ecology and fire management at the time. And that's why I went to school at Texas Tech. Actually, funny story, if you're into that sort of thing. It was probably October of 1982, and I'm about to graduate in December of 1982 from the University of Idaho with my degree in forest science. And it occurs to me that since the Reagan administration had been in office for a couple of years, that there was no chance I was going to get a job as a forester. In fact, the Federal Register was closed for forestry. You couldn't even apply for a federal job as forester in the federal government in the United States. So I'm thinking, yes, I was really that delayed in thinking about my future. I'm walking down the hall, it's probably October, I'm going to graduate in December, and I'm thinking to myself, wonder if I should go to graduate school. And I had no real idea what graduate school was, except that I lived for about a year in college with a person who was going to graduate school, who was getting his graduate degree with Leon Neuenschwander, who was my undergraduate academic advisor. So Leon Neuenschwander had received his PhD working with Henry Wright at Texas Tech University. So he was a pretty well-known fire ecologist at this point, and also prescribed burning specialist. And one of my college roommates was pursuing his master's degree with Leon Neuenschwander. In addition, that particular individual who was my college roommate for about a year had been my supervisor when I worked for the Idaho Department of Lands as a firefighter, as a smoke chaser. And so this guy, Brian, was influential for me. In fact, my first 2 years of undergraduate school, I went to Idaho State University because it was the state university furthest from my parents. And I wanted to escape them at all costs. Like so many children who are 18 years old, I just wanted to get away from my parents and prove that I was an adult. So I was going to Idaho State University, and in the summertime, I was living in Craigmont, Idaho with my parents and working for the Idaho Department of Lands as a smoke chaser. And Brian was my supervisor in that position. So he could tell that I was not a serious college student. And so one day he pulled me off to the side and he said something like, why don't you just knock off that bullshit you're doing? Why don't you get an actual degree, like in forestry, something that you're interested in, and maybe turn your life around a little bit? Well, that was a real slap in the face for me until I realized that he was exactly right, that I was majoring in women and basketball, and I wasn't any good at basketball, and I wasn't all that swift at women for that matter. So he was right, and I transferred to the University of Idaho, picked up Leon Neuenschwander as my undergraduate advisor. Leon was Brian's graduate advisor for the pursuit of his Master of Science degree. And ultimately that led to this undergraduate degree. Anyway, I'm walking down the hall in October of 1982, going to graduate in December of 1982, and I see a flyer on the bulletin board, right? This is 1982, so it's before the internet was announcing all of the graduate positions. And it was for work on fire ecology at Northern Arizona University. And so I took it off the board so that nobody else would see it, so I knew how to get rid of the competition. And I took it into Leon Neuenschwander, and I said, Leon, I think I want to go to graduate school. You know, having thought about it now for 5 minutes, I decided that was the thing to do. And he says, well, all right, but don't go to NAU, because that's not a very good school. And it wasn't a major research university. So he said, why don't I just give Henry a call and see if he's taking any students? Well, I was beside myself, because Henry Wright at the time was a god amongst us undergraduate students who were studying fire ecology. This is somebody who only appears in books and short films and that kind of thing. So this is a big deal that Leon was calling Henry Wright. So I sat there at his desk while he made the phone call, and he said, Henry, do you need any more graduate students? Because I have a good one for you right here. And so I talked to Henry Wright on the phone for about 10 minutes, and that's when and how I committed to getting graduate degrees at Texas Tech. And Henry made it perfectly clear that he was interested only in students for the long term. He didn't want somebody who's going to get a master's degree and then move on to another university. Later, I realized that probably would have been the better route for me, and that's what I recommend for most students, in fact. But I committed to a master's and PhD because once Henry found a good student, he wanted to keep him around for a while because it was the students who really ran the prescribed fire program at Texas Tech, where we were lighting prescribed fires up to 20,000 acres in size. That's a lot. If you're measuring that in hectares, that's a lot. Can't do the math in my head anymore. In any event, so I talked to Henry on the phone. I committed to getting a master's and PhD, and I drove down there that January to start my graduate career. When I arrived at the University of Georgia, I was in the Institute for Ecology. That's the building I was in because that's a building my supervisor, Susan Power Bratton, was in. She had received her PhD working with renowned plant community ecologist Robert Whitaker, and right down the hall from me was a guy named Eugene Odom, one of the premier ecologists of the time. And he was pretty old at that time, but he was still coming into work every day, and I had a couple of occasions to chat with him, sit down and chat with him in his office for a half an hour or an hour. And at the time, this is the kind of thing that would send shivers down the spine of anybody who'd been studying ecology in graduate school for any length of time. So that was pretty exciting for me. So it's pretty interesting. I was reading John McPhee's book, Encounters with the Archdruid, when I was in the process of wrapping up my PhD. Encounters with the Archdruid is comprised of 3 stories. I read it a long time ago, so I might get some of the details wrong. One of the 3 stories, and also one of the 3 chapters, was called A River, and it describes the Archdruid, David Brower, riding down the Colorado River in a raft with Floyd Dominy. And as I recall, Floyd Dominy at the time was the head of the Bureau of Reclamation, which we affectionately referred to as the Bureau of Wreck the Nation, but it's Bureau of Reclamation. And so this was the strategy. This is what John McPhee did. He set up 3 different relatively long-term occasions, a couple of weeks. One with Floyd Dominy in a chapter called The River, and he's floating down the river, John McPhee, the writer, with David Brower, the renowned ecologist and conservationist. And David Brower went along with all 3 of these rides. So it was David Brower, that's the Archdruid, and John McPhee, and one of the renowned people on the other side when we're talking about central issues. So The River had Floyd Dominy. The mountain, which took place in North Cascades National Park, involved a mining engineer, as I recall, somebody who wanted to mine every little bit of copper or any other element from the planet so that we can continue to keep the lights on. And David Brower had a conversation with him over the span of a couple of weeks, and John McPhee was just a recorder. Well, the 3rd chapter in that book was called The Island, and it was taking place on Cumberland Island, the southernmost of Georgia's barrier islands, off the southeastern coast of Georgia. And I was reading that chapter when Susan Bratton called me and asked if I was interested in doing postdoctoral research on Cumberland Island. Now, the person with whom John McPhee and David Brower was speaking on that trip was the guy, I can't remember his name, he developed Hilton Head in South Carolina, turned this beautiful border of the sea and the mainland, turned it into what had been a beautiful oak forest dominated ecosystem into a golf course filled with resorts. And he wanted to do the same thing at Cumberland Island. And it was working great. In fact, it looked like it was going to happen. And then the poor slobs showed up at a Kennedy family wedding. It was the Kennedy Carnegie family that owned the entire island. And he showed up and spread out the blueprints at the wedding reception to show what he was going to do. Well, the Kennedy Carnegie family got so irritated at that, they just gave the land, gave the whole island to the Park Service. So that didn't go well from the developer's perspective. And it was all wilderness, except for a 1 square mile of area called High Point on the island that was given to the residents for the next 99 years. And this was, I believe, in December 1974 when the transition was made. So if we had that long, the private property would turn over and become part of the Cumberland Island National Wilderness Area, or it's called Cumberland Island National Seashore. It would become part of Cumberland Island National Seashore in 99 years after December of 1974. In any event, that was the deal. So this guy showed up at the Kennedy Carnegie family wedding, put out the plans. The family decided, no way. And so they gave it to the Park Service. And Susan Bratton was interested in figuring out why the boundaries between plant communities changed relatively abruptly over the span of years or decades. And so that was my mission, was to do my postdoctoral research trying to figure that out. And I came up with a pretty good story about it that led to a couple of publications. But that's not the story for today.